So I want to talk about labeling. I think it's like an incredibly important part of science. It's an incredibly important part of life, but we often sort of get mixed up with labeling. And so what am I talking about? Is I'm really just like talking about categorizing things, like grouping things together, calling somebody, giving them a name whenever there is a sort of collection of traits together that sort of seem like they kind of loosely hang together. I was thinking about that this morning. And one label that I've sort of identified and did the test and all that kind of stuff later on in life was I figured out I had ADHD. And that was a real big moment for me because it was like, holy crap. I thought this was like the crazy thing. I thought that was never me. I went for years and years and years thinking like, hey, those are those people, that's not me. And then I started some events happened in my life. I don't want to get into too many details, but then I started watching videos on it and, people talking openly about these things on YouTube. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is me. That was like, and it hit me really hard because I always sort of thought like, oh, that's them and not me. And so it hit me really hard because I thought, I was just struggling with things. That was a label that it took me a long time to sort of come to terms with, of thinking of like, hey, I have this thing and this is like who I am. I have to realize now that, it's just a damn label of some characteristics that you actually have, right? And we have to sort of remember that. We sort of stigmatize all of these things. We have this sort of negative connotation of a lot of things, like most things, right? And it's just a damn label, right? The difference between being a little overweight and obese is a damn label that somebody just thought up. And it's an arbitrary point, and I guarantee all this labeling is an arbitrary point where we just have some imaginary, what's called the cut point, where you have above and below this particular cut point, or threshold is another name. We label it in this particular way. And often we have to remember that life itself is not labels. Life itself is a real collection of really complicated things that they kind of loosely hang together. And we also have very much, a continuous flow of things, right? We don't really necessarily have this thing or the other thing. Is very much a sort of continuous flow of, moving from one thing to the next. And the reason why we call it something is because of our vocabulary. We're really limited in how we understand the world, and we think easily. We think more clearly by having these labels, yet the labels are imperfect, they're wrong. And so we have to be very careful about labeling different things, and be careful about the meaning behind these particular things. So I want to give you another example, right? Organic or natural, or vitamins or whatever, right? To give you a quantitative example or a qualitative example, I used to take ibuprofen and Tylenol, and I've been taking them more and more because I've been having more aches and pains as I've been getting older. And the reason is that there is a science behind this, right? There is clinical trials behind these things, are pretty robustly tested. So we know all of the different, for the most part, we know all of the adverse reactions and all those kind of adverse events that are going to happen from this. And I've always shied away from taking any, naturopathic remedies because of the fact that they're just not well studied. We don't really understand these things. So in the past month, I've been getting aches and pains, and I've been taking, I tried it out because I went to the pharmacy and they actually had this there. I was like, let me give it a shot. I don't know. Let's see. CBD oil. And I put it on my aches and pains, And it was the first moment that I was like, wow, this actually does work. I definitely have tried all the homeopathic, I've tried them and stuff because, early on in my upbringing, that's what I was raised on. My parents were less on the, sort of science side. They didn't care about this kind of stuff. So I was, raised on all those kind of things. And it was the first moment that it actually did work. Something that I tried that was homeopathic or that was kind of like popular culture. And it's me, right? Like I've got this thing against popular culture because I know a lot of stuff is just crap in popular culture, right? It's just crap once you start looking at the evidence. But this actually worked for me. And here's the trouble with it though, is that we label it as like healthy or organic or any of those kind of things. And the problem is that we can't test those particular things. So we have no idea on the opposite side and whether that there is any negative adverse events that are related to this because there's no testing that's being done on it. So part of the reason why I've switched to CBD oil is because I'm nervous about the side effects of ibuprofen and Tylenol, right? Like they're not good to take in a prolonged way. They're not good for your kidneys. They're not good for, bleeding and all those kind of things. So I'm nervous about taking them. But now, because we have an unproven medicine, I think the evidence is, at least qualitatively on my side, the evidence is that it works. But I also think, I kind of looked up some clinical studies and stuff like that after, and there is evidence that it reduces inflammation. Whether it's good evidence or not, it's hard for me to assess that. They were not in great journals. But, I would say that there's probably evidence that they do work. Now, the problem is because it's not labeled. It's not, it's not considered sort of legitimate at this point. We don't have very good understanding, right? Like it is really weak understanding of how all this kind of stuff works. We don't know the adverse events. I might be taking this stuff and it's worse for me, for my kidneys and all that kind of stuff, and yet we don't know, right? Another one like that is any of the sweeteners that are out there. Some of the sweeteners are actually really well tested, but something like a stevia, for example, which I switched to and I've been taking a long time, but I've switched off of it in the last month, because I think I've been getting migraine headaches from it. And since I took it off, the migraines have subsided a lot. So what I'm getting at is labeling has pros and cons, right? Labeling is something that is helpful in the sense that we can put our fingers on what this particular thing is, right? We don't quite know, from what I understand, there's no clear mechanism of why CBD works. There's no clear understanding of the adverse events, adverse reactions that you might get from it. So, it's the same way because we've labeled ADHD, we understand it more, but it's still just a trait, right? Like it is a human trait, that some of us have, some of us don't. It's diversity in human behaviors. It's diversity in how we operate, right? You look at any organism in this world, you look at anything, no matter what it is, they're all different. No matter, you look at rocks, they're all different crystal structures. You look at trees, they're all different. You look at human beings, they're all different, and yet we want to label these things and put them all together and cluster them together when they're really not. They're loose collections of how these things work. And even if you look at the characteristics, if you were to study the characteristics of something that you're like, well, this is a real clear label, right? Like ADHD or ADD or any of those kind of things. You look at it and you look at how these correlate together statistically, that they're not very strong correlates. Generally, you look at anything in the social sciences, in the physical sciences, there's generally not strong correlations between them. So what does that mean? they loosely hang together. Sometimes they hang together, sometimes they don't, right? Like sometimes something goes up, and sometimes it doesn't go up, and another thing doesn't go up. It's a very loose probabilistic understanding of how this stuff actually works. So we need to take all of this with a grain of salt. We need to work on the fact that yes, there are underlying things, underlying structures and traits and things like that underlie reality, right? But we also have to destigmatize, work on, wait a minute, this is just traits. This is not some sort of like, oh my God, big boogeyman kind of stuff. And that's part of medicine tends to do the boogeyman approach of like, oh my God, the world's falling apart if you have all this kind of stuff, right? And that's just medicine. That's the approach they take. It's a different kind of science, and they're all into sort of categorizing. And I apologize to anybody that's kind of in medicine listening to this. Is very much so they categorize, the world around us, and then they sort of boogeyman it. But we need to take a step back and say, wait a minute, these are just traits and differences between human behavior. Doesn't mean that we need to automatically medicate everything, and we have to take a step back and say, wait a minute, really think about this. Think about how all of this works, and be careful with sort of changing things. I'm not saying to not pursue any of the alternatives that are out there. They do work, right? So I mentioned that I have migraine attacks pretty regularly, I would say. So since I took out stevia, it's maybe once a week, maybe once every other week. But it's very new, right? I'm not gonna go on record saying that. So this is all pretty new. But I do have them. You look at the best available migraine medication. You look at I looked at it, the Nurtec. That is the best available migraine medication right now with very little side effects. Not necessarily, but quote unquote, what they say is the only proven medicine on the market. You look at it, and the actual effect size is ridiculous. It's tiny in terms of how many people reported having less effects. I think it was or less migraine effects. I can't remember what you have to look it up, but it was a 10% reduction, tiny. And yet, it works, right? And even Tylenol, something that we all know really works. If you look at the clinical studies behind them, the effect size is not as big as what you think it is. First of all, it doesn't sort of work for everybody, right? And then to the extent that it works for you, if it works for you, is not as big for somebody else. I don't know what those effect size are right now. I don't sort of I haven't looked that up, but I know it's not as big as what you think it is. It is, we think of treatments and medicine as you take this, everything's hunky-dory. But that's not the way it works, right? That is not the world. And I think physicians that are good understand this. They get it. They get that it's a probabilistic world. But there is a lot of boogeyman approach kind of folks that are out there that don't want to sort of tell this more fine-grained, complex story. And we just have to take this in for a grain of salt and realize whatever ailment that you have, it shouldn't be stigmatized. It is what it is. You got heart problems. It is what it is. And then work on trying to improve it, both medically and as well as with the way that you manage it with any other physical ailment that you have, working to adapt, losing weight, those kind of things. All of that stuff matters. All of that stuff really is important. So that's where I want to say is labeling is important because it allows you to understand the pros and cons of something, but at the same time, be careful when you label because we tend to stigmatize groups when we have labels. All right, take care and have a wonderful day.